Chapter 41. The Siege of La Rochelle. The Siege of La Rochelle was one of the greatest events of the reign of Louis XIII. The political views of the cardinal when he undertook the siege were extensive. Of the important cities which had been given by Henry IV to the Huguenots as places of safety, La Rochelle alone remained. The cardinal wished to destroy this last bulwark of Calvinism. La Rochelle, which had derived additional importance from the ruin of the other Calvinistic towns, was, besides, the last port which remained open to the English in the kingdom of France, and by closing it to England, our eternal enemy, the cardinal would end the work of Joan of Arc and of the Duke of Guise. Thus it was that Bassompierre, who was at the same time both Protestant and Catholic, Protestant from conviction and Catholic as commander of the Order of the Saint-Esprit, Bassompierre, who was German by birth and a Frenchman at heart, Bassompierre, who had particular command at the siege of La Rochelle, said, on charging at the head of many other Protestant noblemen like himself, "You will see, gentlemen, that we shall be fools enough to take La Rochelle." And Bassompierre was right. The cannonades at the Isle of Ré were a prelude to the dragonnades of the Cevennes. The taking of La Rochelle was the preface to the Edict of Nantes. But, by the side of these general views of the leveling and simplifying minister, which belong to history, the chronicler is obliged to dwell upon the petty objects of the lover and the jealous rival. Richelieu, as everyone knows, had been enamored of the queen. Had this love a purely political aim, or was it of those profound passions with which Anne of Austria inspired those who were around her? This is what we cannot satisfactorily decide. Yet at all events it has been seen by the circumstances which have been detailed in this history that Buckingham had gained a superiority over him in 2 or 3 points, and that, especially in the affair of the diamond studs, thanks to the devotion of the Three Musketeers and the courage of D'Artagnan, he had most cruelly befooled him. It was Richelieu's object, therefore, not merely to rid France of an enemy, but to revenge himself on a rival. The revenge ought, too, to have been great and signal, and completely worthy of the man who held in his hand as a weapon the forces of a whole realm. Richelieu knew that in fighting against England he was fighting against Buckingham, that in triumphing over England he should triumph over Buckingham, and lastly that in humiliating England in the eyes of Europe he should humiliate Buckingham in the eyes of the Queen. On his part, Buckingham, whilst he was putting the honor of England prominently forward as his motive, was impelled by interests absolutely similar to those of the cardinal. Buckingham also pursued a private revenge. Under no pretext had Buckingham been able to enter France as an ambassador, and he wished therefore to enter it as a conqueror. It follows from this that the true stake in the game which 2 powerful kingdoms were playing for the pleasure of 2 amorous men was nothing more than a glance from the eye of Anne of Austria. The Duke of Buckingham had gained the first advantage. Arriving unexpectedly before the Isle of Ré with 90 vessels and 20,000 men, he had surprised the Count de Torras, who was the king's commander in that isle, and after a bloody contest, had accomplished a disembarkation. Let us record, by the way, that the Baron de Chantal fell in this combat, leaving an orphan daughter, a little girl 18 months old. This little girl was afterwards Madame de Sévigné. The Count de Torras retreated into the citadel of Saint-Martin with his garrison, and threw 100 men into a small fort which was called the Port of La Prée. This event had hastened the decision of the cardinal, and until he and the king could go and take the command of the siege of La Rochelle, which was resolved on, he had sent his Majesty's brother forward to direct the first operations, and had made all the troops of which he could dispose march towards the theatre of war. It was to this detachment of the army, which was sent forward as a vanguard, that our friend D'Artagnan belonged. The king, as we have said, was to follow when his court of justice had been held. On rising from this sitting on the 28th of June, he had found himself seized with fever. He had nevertheless persisted in setting out, but, getting worse, he had been obliged to stop at Villeroy. Now, where the king stopped, there also stopped the musketeers. Hence it followed that D'Artagnan, who was only in the guards, found himself separated, for a time at least, from his good friends, Athos, Porthos, and Aramis. This separation, which was only annoying to him, would certainly have become a source of serious anxiety had he been able to discern by what unsuspected dangers he was surrounded. Nevertheless, he arrived without mishap at the camp before La Rochelle. Everything was at present in the same state. The Duke of Buckingham and the English, in possession of the Isle of Ré, continued to besiege, but without success, the fort of La Prée and the citadel of Saint-Martin, and the hostilities with La Rochelle had commenced 2 or 3 days before about a battery which the Duc d'Angoulême had just constructed near the city. The guards under Monsieur d'Essarts were stationed at the Minimes. But we know that D'Artagnan, engrossed by the ambition of becoming a musketeer, had formed but few intimacies with his comrades, and found himself therefore isolated and abandoned to his own reflections. And these reflections were not cheerful. During the year that he had been in Paris, he had engaged himself in public affairs, and consequently his own private affairs, either of love or of fortune, had made no great advances. As to love, the only woman for whom he had a sincere affection was Madame Bonancieux, and Madame Bonancieux had disappeared, nor could he yet discover what had become of her. As to fortune, he, a mere insect, had made an enemy of the cardinal, that is to say, of a man before whom the nobles of the kingdom trembled, and even the king himself. That man had power to crush him, and yet he had abstained. To a mind as clear-sighted as that of D'Artagnan, this forbearance was a dawn which gave promise of a happier futurity. Then he had made himself another enemy, less to be dreaded as he thought, but one whom he felt instinctively was not to be despised. That enemy was her ladyship. In exchange for all this, he had the protection and goodwill of the Queen, but Her Majesty's goodwill was, in the circumstances of the times, only an additional course of persecution, and her protection, it is known, protected very badly, witness Chalais and Madame Bonancieux. So that what he had most manifestly gained in all this was the diamond, worth 5,000 or 6,000 francs, which he wore upon his finger, and even this diamond, supposing that he must preserve it, to remind the Queen at some future day of her gratitude, had not in the meantime, since he could not dispose of it, any greater value than the pebbles he trampled beneath his feet. We say the pebbles that he trampled beneath his feet, for D'Artagnan made these reflections whilst he was walking alone in a pretty little path which led from the camp to an adjoining village. But these reflections had led him further than he intended, and the day was beginning to decline when, by the last ray of the setting sun, he seemed to perceive the barrel of a musket glittering behind a hedge. D'Artagnan had a quick eye and a ready wit. He comprehended that the musket had not come there of itself, and that he who held it was not concealed behind a hedge with any amicable intentions. He determined, therefore, to gain the open country, but on the other side of the road, behind a rock, he perceived the muzzle of a second musket. It was, evidently, an ambuscade. The young man gave a glance at the first musket, and beheld with some anxiety that it was aiming in his direction. But as soon as he saw the orifice of the barrel motionless, he threw himself upon his face. At that instant the shot was fired, and he heard the whistling of a ball as it passed over his head. There was no time to lose. D'Artagnan raised himself up with a bound, and at the same moment the bullet of the second musket scattered the stones in the very part of the path where he had thrown himself down. D'Artagnan was not one of those foolishly brave men who seek a ridiculous death in order to have it said of them that they never retreated a step. Besides, courage could do nothing here. He had fallen into an ambuscade. "If there's a third shot," said he to himself, "I'm a dead man." He immediately scampered toward the camp with all the swiftness of his countrymen, who are so famous for their activity, but fast as was his course, the one who had fired first, having had time to reload his gun, made another shot at him, so well directed this time, that the ball passed through his hat and drove it 10 paces before him. As D'Artagnan had no other hat, he picked it up as he ran and reached his lodging, pale and out of breath. He sat down without speaking to anyone and began to reflect. This event might have had three causes. The first and most natural was that it might be an ambuscade from La Rochelle, whose citizens would not have been sorry to kill one of His Majesty's guards, as it would make one enemy the less, and that enemy might have had a well-filled purse in his pocket. D'Artagnan took his hat, examined the hole that the ball had made, and shook his head. That bullet did not belong to a musket, but to an arquebus. The precision of the aim had already made him think that it was fired by a civilian weapon, so it was not a military ambuscade since the ball was not of that caliber. It might have been a kind memorial of the cardinal. It may be remembered that at the very moment when, thanks to the blessed beam of sunshine, he had perceived the gun barrel, he was marveling at the leniency His Eminence had shown towards him. But D'Artagnan shook his head with an air of doubt. The cardinal seldom had recourse to such means towards people whom a movement of his hand might crush. It might be her ladyship's revenge. This conjecture was more reasonable. He tried in vain to recall either the features or the dress of the assassins, but he had hurried away too rapidly to have leisure to remark them. "Ah, my poor friends," muttered D'Artagnan, "where are you? Alas, how much I miss you!" D'Artagnan passed a very bad night. 3 or 4 times he awoke with a start, fancying that a man approached his bed to stab him. Yet the day dawned without any incident having occurred during the darkness. But D'Artagnan suspected that what is deferred is not therefore lost. He remained in his quarters throughout the whole day, and gave as an excuse to himself the dullness of the weather. At 9 o'clock on the next morning they beat to arms. The Duke of Orleans was visiting the pickets. The guards mustered, and D'Artagnan took his place amidst his comrades. His Royal Highness passed in front of the line, and then all the superior officers approached to pay their respects to him. Monsieur d'Essarts, the captain of the guards, went with the others. After a short time, D'Artagnan thought that he perceived Monsieur d'Essarts making a sign to him to draw near. He waited for another gesture, fearing that he might have been mistaken, but on its being repeated, he left the ranks and advanced to receive the order. His Royal Highness is about to ask for volunteers for a dangerous expedition, which will be honorable to those who perform it, and I made you a sign that you might hold yourself in readiness. "Thank you, Captain," replied D'Artagnan, who required nothing better than to distinguish himself before the eyes of the Lieutenant General. The Rochellais had, in fact, made a sortie during the night, and recaptured a bastion which the royal army had invested 2 days before. The idea was to push a forlorn hope so forward as to be able to discover in what manner the enemy guarded this bastion. After a few minutes, His Royal Highness raised his voice and said, "I want 3 or 4 volunteers for this expedition, led by a man who can be depended upon." "As for your trustworthy man, here he is," said Monsieur d'Essarts, pointing to D'Artagnan. "And as for the 4 or 5 volunteers, your Royal Highness has only to make your wishes known, and the men will not be wanting." "4 men who will volunteer to come and be killed with me," cried D'Artagnan, raising his sword. 2 of his companions in the guards rushed toward him instantaneously, and 2 other soldiers having joined them, the number was complete. D'Artagnan therefore rejected all others to avoid injustice to those who had the prior claim. It was not known whether the Rochellais, after having taken the bastion, had evacuated it or placed a garrison in it. It was therefore necessary to examine the spot from a point sufficiently near to ascertain this point. D'Artagnan went off with his 4 companions in the line of the trench. The 2 guards marched by his side, and the 2 soldiers in the rear. Sheltering themselves in this manner by the rampart, they arrived within 100 paces of the bastion, and, on turning around at that moment, D'Artagnan perceived that the 2 soldiers had disappeared. Believing them to have remained behind from fear, he continued to advance. At the turn of the counterscarp, they found themselves about 60 yards from the bastion, but they saw no one, and the bastion seemed evacuated. The 3 volunteers deliberated whether they should advance farther, when suddenly a circle of smoke appeared, and a dozen balls whistled around D'Artagnan and his companions. They knew now what they had come to learn. The bastion was guarded, A longer delay, therefore, in so dangerous a place would have been only an unnecessary imprudence, so D'Artagnan and the two guards turned their backs and began a rapid retreat. On reaching the angle of the trench, which would serve as a rampart to them, one of the guards fell with a ball through his chest, whilst the other, who was safe and sound, made the best of his way to the camp. D'Artagnan would not thus abandon a companion, and leaned over him to lift him up and aid him to regain the lines, but at that very moment 2 shots were fired. One ball shattered the head of the man who was already wounded, and the other was flattened against a rock after having passed within 2 inches of D'Artagnan's body. The young man turned very quickly, for this attack could not come from the bastion, which was hidden by the angle of the trench. The remembrance of the 2 soldiers who had abandoned him occurred to his mind, and suggested to him his assassins of the previous evening. He resolved on this occasion to find out what it meant, and fell therefore upon the body of his comrade as though he had been dead. He immediately saw that the 2 heads were raised above an abandoned breastwork, which was about 30 yards from him, that they were those of the 2 soldiers. D'Artagnan was not mistaken. These men had remained behind solely for the purpose of assassinating him, hoping that the death of the young man would be imputed to the attack of the enemy. But as he might only be wounded, he might denounce their crime, and they drew near to complete their work. Happily, deceived by the sight of D'Artagnan's position, they neglected to reload their muskets. When they were about 3 paces from him, D'Artagnan, who had taken special care in falling not to relinquish his sword, suddenly arose and sprang upon them. The assassins were well aware that if they fled toward the camp without having killed their man, they should be accused by him, and therefore their first impulse was to pass over to the enemy. One of them took his gun by the barrel and made use of it as a club. As he dealt a terrible blow at D'Artagnan, he avoided it by jumping aside. By this movement, however, D'Artagnan opened a passage to the bandit, who immediately sprang forth toward the bastion. But as the Rochelle who guarded it were ignorant of his intentions in advancing, they fired upon him, and he fell with his shoulder broken by a ball. In the meantime, D'Artagnan threw himself on the second soldier with his sword. Their struggle was not long. This wretch had only his discharged fusée to defend himself with. The sword of the guardsman glided along the barrel of this useless weapon, and passed through the assassin's thigh. As soon as he had fallen, D'Artagnan applied the point of his weapon to his throat. "Oh, do not kill me!" exclaimed the bandit. "Pardon, sir, and I will confess everything." "Is it worth my while to grant you your life for your secret?" demanded the young man. "Yes, if you consider life of any value to a man of 22 years of age, who, being as handsome and as brave as you are, may accomplish anything." "Wretch," cried D'Artagnan, "come, speak quickly. Who engaged you to assassinate me?" "A woman whom I do not know, but who is called my lady." "But if you do not know this woman, how come you to know her name?" "My comrade knew her and called her so. It was with him that she arranged the affair, not with me. He has a letter from this person now in his pocket, which would be of great importance to you, according to what I heard him say." "But how came you to be his partner in this ambuscade?" "He proposed me to join him in it, and I agreed." "And how much has she paid you for this pretty expedition?" 100 louis. "Well, upon my word," said the young man, laughing, "she thinks me of some value. 100 louis, it's quite a fortune for 2 wretches like you. I can well understand that you would accept it, and so I pardon you, but on one condition." "What is that?" said the soldier, uneasy at discovering that all was not yet ended. "That you go and get me the letter out of your companion's pocket." "But," exclaimed the bandit, "that is only another way of killing me. How can you ask me to go for the letter under the very fire of that bastion?" "But you must make up your mind to go for it, or I swear that you will die directly by my hand." "Mercy, sir, mercy, in the name of that young lady whom you love, and whom perhaps you imagine dead, but who is not so," screamed the bandit, throwing himself upon his knees and supporting himself on his hand, for he was beginning to lose his strength, along with his blood. "And how do you know that there is a young lady whom I love, and that I have believed her to be dead?" demanded D'Artagnan. "By that letter in my comrade's pocket." "You see, then, that I must have that letter," said D'Artagnan. "So let us have no longer delay, no more hesitation, or whatever may be my repugnance to bathe my sword a second time in the blood of such a wretch as you are. I swear to you on the word of an honorable man." At these words, D'Artagnan made such a threatening gesture that the wounded man arose. "Stop, stop!" exclaimed he, recovering courage through the very force of fear. "I will go, I will go." D'Artagnan took the soldier's arquebus, made him walk before him, and urged him at the same time toward his companion, by pricking him in the loins with that point of his sword. It was a fearful spectacle to witness this unhappy being leaving a long track of blood upon the path he took, growing pale from the approach of death, and yet striving to drag himself without being seen to the body of his accomplice, which was stretched out at a distance of 20 paces. Terror was so depicted on his countenance, which was covered with an icy sweat, that D'Artagnan both pitied and despised him. "Come," said he, "I will show you the difference between a man of courage and a coward like you. Wait where you are, I will go." And with an active step and his eye upon the bastion, observing the proceedings of the enemy, and availing himself of every inequality of ground, he managed to advance as far as the second soldier. There were two methods of accomplishing his purpose, either to search him where he was, or to carry him away, making a buckler of his body, and then to search him at leisure in the trench. D'Artagnan preferred the second plan, and had thrown the body of the assassin on his shoulders just at the very moment that the enemy fired. A slight tremor, a final cry, a shudder of agony proved to D'Artagnan that he who had sought to assassinate him had now saved his life. D'Artagnan reached the trench and threw the body by the side of the wounded man, who was quite as pale as the dead one. He then began to take an inventory. There was a leather pocketbook, a purse, which evidently contained a part of the sum which the banditti had received, and a dice box and dice, and these composed the inheritance of the dead man. He left the dice box and dice where they had fallen, threw the purse to the wounded man, and eagerly opened the pocketbook. Amongst several unimportant papers, he found the following letter. It was that for which he had gone to search at the hazard of his life. "Since you have lost track of that woman, and she is now in safety in the convent, which you never ought to have allowed her to reach, take care at any rate not to miss the man, otherwise you know that I have a long arm, and you shall pay dearly for the 100 louis which you have had of mine." There was no signature. Nevertheless, it was evident that the letter was from her ladyship. He kept it, therefore, as a testimony against her, and finding himself in safety behind the angle of the trench, he began to question the wounded man. The latter confessed that he had been engaged with his comrade, the same who had now been killed, to carry off a young woman, who was to leave Paris by the barrier of La Villette, but that having stopped drinking at a wine shop, they had been 10 minutes too late for the carriage. "But what were you to have done with this woman?" demanded D'Artagnan in an agony of doubt. "We were to have taken her to a hotel in the Place Royale," said the wounded man. Yes, muttered D'Artagnan, "that is it, to her ladyship herself." The young man shuddered as he comprehended with how terrible a thirst for vengeance this woman was impelled to destroy him and those who loved him, and how well she was acquainted with the secrets of the court, since she had detected even this. For this exact information she was indebted to the cardinal. But, as some degree of compensation, he ascertained with unfeigned joy that the queen had at last discovered the prison to which Madame Bonacieux had been sent to expiate her devotion, and had already rescued her from it. Thus the letter which he had received from the young woman and her appearance in the carriage on the Chaillot road were explained to him. Thenceforth, as Athos had predicted, it was possible to find Madame Bonacieux again, and a convent was not impregnable. This idea disposed his heart to clemency. He turned toward the wounded man, who watched all the charges of his countenance with anxiety, and stretching out his arm to him, "Come," said he, "I will not leave you here. Rest on me, and let us return to the camp." "Yes," said the wounded man, who could hardly credit so much magnanimity. "But is it not to have me hanged?" "You have my word," replied he. "For the second time I grant you your life." The wounded man fell on his knees and kissed the feet of his preserver, but D'Artagnan, who had no longer any motive for remaining so near the enemy himself, cut short these displays of gratitude. The guard, who had returned at the first discharge from the bastion, had announced the death of his 4 companions. There was, therefore, both great astonishment and great joy in the regiment when they saw the young man returning safe and sound. D'Artagnan explained the sword wound of his companion by a sortie which he invented. He recounted the death of the other soldier and the perils they had run. This account was the occasion of a veritable triumph to him, for one day the whole army spoke of his expedition, and His Royal Highness himself sent to compliment him on his conduct. And lastly, as every good action brings its recompense with it, that of D'Artagnan had the happy result of restoring to him the tranquillity that he had lost. In fact, the young man thought that he might cease to be disturbed, since his 2 enemies, one was killed and the other devoted to his interests. This tranquillity, however, proved one thing, that D'Artagnan did not yet thoroughly estimate her ladyship.